is possibly the most interesting session of the day, where we're going to continue this theme of chemical engineering field being infiltrated, with another biologist, but even more so this time with a psychologist. This last session is entitled Towards a Circular Economy, Mobilizing Key Practices and Systems at Community Scale and Beyond. And it's a great pleasure to welcome our plenary speaker, Shannon Bouton, who is the president and founding CEO of Delterra, which is an environmental non-profit dedicated to transforming waste management and accelerating the transition to a circular economy, mostly in the global south, but across other countries as well. She will then be joined by John Pickering, Chief Behavioural Scientist and co-founder of Evidn, an international applied behavioural science organisation. John's a real expert in systems level thinking around driving behaviour change and is one of our older affiliate members, or Evidn is one of our older affiliate members, and John is a non-resident fellow at the Erlanger Centre. Shannon's full CV, not bio, is in the booklet, so I'm not going to go any further, but please come to the stage and we look forward to hearing from you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's lovely to be here. I haven't spoken to a group of academics in many years because my academic career ended up going into other fields. So it's always lovely to come back to these spaces. So I wanted just to start by saying Delterra is an organization that we founded to try and figure out how to bridge the gap between global ambition and local action. So we specifically focus on, as it says here, envisioning a world where human activities protect and restore a healthy planet. We decided to start with waste. And for those of you who don't know why we would start with waste, I thought I'd give you just a little sense of what this looks like in the global south. So every day, the world produces probably about 5.5 million tons of waste. The data on waste, as Andre alluded to, is very rough, and so we don't know exactly what's going on. But in countries where the waste management system is not properly set up, that leads to this type of scene, which is a photo I took in Bali, where waste is literally just overflowing into the street. This site is supposed to be a recycling center, and people are just bringing their waste there and dumping it there because they don't know where else to put it. So this is a major problem, and when you have this type of situation with waste, obviously a lot of it ends up in the ocean, and I'm sure many of you have read the articles about whales washing up on beaches with bellies full of plastic. About 10 million tons of plastic enters the ocean every year. It's a particular problem in the waste stream, in the whole waste stream, because of course it's a long-lived product that doesn't biodegrade easily. But the problem is actually not a problem in the ocean first, it is a problem on land. So you can't fix this unless you fix the problems on land. So today, in our 8 billion people on the planet, about 2.3 billion people do not have access to any type of waste collection. This is not just an environmental problem, it's a public health problem. So when you have this type of situation, you have an increase in diseases from vermin, and then you also have problems with malaria and dengue and other mosquito-borne diseases that are caused by water sitting open. And as one study in Pakistan, for example, found that children who live in houses where there is no waste collection have 2.5 times higher chance of having chronic diarrhea. So you have major issues with health problems as a result of waste. And the result of not having collection is that about 40% of the world's waste, and that's an average globally, is subject to open burning and dumping, right? So in Indonesia, that's as high as 60%, if you believe the government numbers, right? So it could be even higher. It's likely to be even higher. When you burn your waste like this, these materials were not designed for this type of end of use. So when you have materials like plastic that are being burned, you are releasing toxic chemicals into the environment, where they would have been relatively stable if you had left them in the plastic form and just put them into a landfill. So this is a major issue that we also need to be thinking about. About 10% of the world's environmental mercury comes from burning of waste in this form. It's also considered now to be one of the top sources of greenhouse gas emissions for the developing world. So in Indonesia, it's considered the third largest source of greenhouse gases. And then on top of all of those problems, you also have this incredible informality that exists in this system. So this woman is a waste picker in Indonesia. Very unusual that she actually has a pair of gloves. I'm not sure that my team didn't actually give it to her before they took the picture. But you can see that the conditions that she's working in are very unsanitary. And there is a huge amount of human trafficking that goes on in this space, right? People, it's a sort of indentured servitude. People get into they get paid in food, they get stuck in working in this space, and they can't get out. And we've even gone to the dumps and tried to hire people off the dumps and had them tell us, you have to pay for my housing in order to get me off the dump because my current boss pays for my house, and that's the most important thing. So dealing with these informal waste pickers also and bringing them into the system, formalizing them is a big part, and making sure that they have health and safety conditions and training is really important to us as well. So across, Delterra thinks about this as a sort of the waste management and getting material back into the circular system as a supply and demand challenge. On the supply side, we're looking at trying to recover material from the multiple places that it gets sent out into. When I used to work in energy efficiency, we used to talk about collecting or solving for energy efficiency being like flying an airplane over the United States and throwing bags of quarters out the window and then going back out and trying to find them. I think the same analogy works for recycling, right? Where we are spreading out a bunch of material out into the space and then hoping that we can get people to bring it back to us and recover that. So we're working on improving that supply by working with cities and municipalities and villages to train people on how to separate their waste, how to collect efficiently. And then on the demand side, we've heard several times today about the fact that there just isn't enough demand for this material, and part of the problem is around contamination. So almost all of today has been around this side of the equation, like how do you figure out how to get the material properly recycled and back into the supply chain? So this part of this presentation will be much more around this, how do we collect it back and how do we make sure we're doing that efficiently. But we do work on this other side too to try and build markets, especially for hard to recycle materials like flexible plastics and organics. So let me just walk you through some of the challenges that we're facing and we're trying to solve as we go. And again, this is a very simplified supply chain, because as somebody pointed out to me earlier, there's really a network going on here. The first problem is to think about consumers and households. So in this space, you have to get people to actually separate their waste, right? Because the biggest contaminant we have in dry recycling is the organics. So the ideal situation is that you have three-stream recycling. You have organics, you have dry recyclables that are actually recyclable, and then you have residue. So you have to train households what goes in what bin. And you have to try and demystify recycling, because it's really tough to remember what goes into what bin. We also have a whole bunch of product leakage in this space, because very few people actually recycle. The United States has about an average participation rate of about 30%. And in some communities, obviously, it's higher, but it is pretty low, actually. So we're working at trying to get that increased. On the collection and sortation side, you have suboptimal collection. So sometimes the collection is spotty, it doesn't always come, people don't know when to put their waste out, they're not collecting different types of waste streams. And then we also, especially in Latin America, see that there's a lot of infrastructure that is chronically underutilized. So we're working to try and improve the efficiency of that part of the system so that it is more economic. Normally what happens in many economies then is, because collection is happening in sort of fragmented ways, there's not a huge amount of waste coming, or any one stream of waste coming in any one place. And so you'll often get aggregators into the system. In places like India, you can get 9 levels of aggregators in the system. And each one of them is providing a different service. But the overall goal is to get as pure a stream of waste as possible, whether it's PET plastic or it's pure organics or whatever it is. And then also you can usually sell those materials if they have value at a higher price if you're getting them if you're selling them at a higher volume. So aggregators are playing that role of making it easier for the next set of the value chain to get bigger deliveries of material. And then, of course, you see a lot of logistics problems. So this adds a huge amount of cost and greenhouse gas emissions to the recycling value chain when you have to trek waste from one part of a country to another in order to actually get it recycled. Then you are working with the recycling processors or the reclaimers. In plastic, this is the group that turns a bale into a pellet. And you also see a really deep concern about insufficient supply and unstable supply into that system, and then also unstable demand on the other side of that system. And so it's difficult to make a business case often for these players. And this is one of the places where, of course, regulation needs to start to come in. And then finally, in the packaging design, right, or in the design of your products, we have completely unnecessary complexity that's going into design of packaging sometimes. I mean, I don't know, I'm sure many of you have dealt with a package that you look at and you're like, well, what material is this? Does this go in the recycling bin or not? Right? Because there are too many different pieces and component pieces of it. And then there's also a lack of incentive to design for recycled content. So this is the regulatory part that could actually really make a difference, is if you start to mandate proportions of your packaging that have to be made from recycled content, that could overnight create a demand that would solve for some of these problems in the supply chain. And I'm going to go a little bit more into that unnecessary complexity just so you understand what I'm talking about. But the other pieces that come in here are, of course, lack of financial incentive and financial investment in the space, so lack of financing, partly because pieces of this value chain have no return on investment. And then, of course, the human rights issues and environmental issues that come along with a lot of this. So just to give you a sense of what's going on with the packaging changes, and Andre alluded to some of this too, right? About 10 years ago, you would have only had the option to buy your tomato paste in a steel can, or your powdered clothing soap in a board box, right? These things for municipalities had value. They had real value. So if they sorted them out in their material recovery facilities, they were able to sell them for, at steel, $225 a ton, right? It's quite a lot of money. Then, as you know, far back as last year, but probably further back as well, you were looking at things like aseptic cartons, which is things like Tetra Pak, your milk cartons and stuff like that. That is a mix of materials. Tetra Pak has gone to great lengths to make sure that people consider this recyclable. It's actually being downcycled into sort of things like building materials. It can't be turned back into a package, but it still has a value because of that. And then HDPE jugs, highly recyclable, but not highly valuable, especially because you can't get the color back out of it. So if you have a specific color in your HDPE, it's going to be really hard to recycle it into anything that's not black. Except in India, where they sort by color, which it's been amazing. And then, now we've got this transition into these multi-layer pouches that are a real problem for recycling. Many times they have multiple different types of plastic in layers on them. And then they also have sometimes metal, aluminum will be woven into them as well. So that makes it incredibly difficult to recycle these things. Often they will go to incineration in cement kilns. And that means that many times municipalities actually have to pay someone to take them away. So these changes in packaging, which are driven by consumer preferences, all of our preferences for what we're buying, are driving towards recycling being less and less economic for municipalities around the world. And in the global south, as Andre shared, we are seeing this proliferation of sachets and pouches. This is a picture I took last week in Bali, but it is a place, it's something you would see anywhere in the global south, where you're seeing small amounts of material being sold because people can't afford the full package, to buy that full package. Sometimes these are things like chili sauce, oil, shampoo, cream rinse. So and everyone buys them like this, right? And these packages, because in many cases they're metallized, they have zero value. They're too small to make it through a recycling system. So this is what you see along roadsides, littered everywhere, right? Floating in the ocean when you're diving, etc. So these are a major issue that we also need to be thinking about how to solve for. And I can't forget to mention organic waste, because Delterra does the whole recycling chain, right? But I'm going to be talking mostly about the dry recyclables, but there's coming up with end markets, as per my question earlier, for organics is a major, major issue as well. So given that we were thinking about system change here, I was starting to think about, what goes into system change from a perspective for us in this type of system. And I was thinking that it really comes down to sort of two things. The first one is sustainability, and I don't mean environmental sustainability, I mean stickiness. Like, how do you get this thing to stick in that system? And this is, the first part of this is figuring out what is your unit of scale. What is the unit at which you need to change what's happening, and that then can scale up at a national level in order to start to change things. And that is in things that, and in order to get that stickiness, you have to be thinking about things like embedded behavior change, sufficient capabilities to operate that system, ownership of the system, so you want it to stick, stable economics, so that it actually can stand on its own without philanthropic dollars afterwards. And then data tracing and transparency, so you can track when it starts to collapse, and you can go back in and fix pieces of it and make sure that you have the right data on this. And then scalability, we're starting to think about things like making sure that it's low complexity, right? So you'll see the same theme going through as you start to scale it from one to the next, right? Can you start to reduce the number of people, the resources that you're putting into scaling it? And that requires that it be low complexity. Also that there is political and public ownership of what it is that you're trying to drive in that change. Reasonable cost, or that it's investable. And then obviously financing for the system, right? Because it is a major issue in terms of the lack of money in many of these systems. So if I start by talking about that stickiness and how we think about this and how we drive this at Delterra, the very first part is behavior change, right? Getting people to actually sort their waste and figuring out what that incentive is. In the United States, for the last, whatever it is, 5-6 decades, we have asked people to recycle by handing them a flyer and saying, please put this in your bin, or bins, depending on what era you were in. And maybe it says something like, it's good for the environment, right? That drives very little incentive for anyone. So we do a lot of human-centered design. We go into communities, we ask them what matters to them, what would motivate them to change their behavior in their households and in their businesses. And we find it's very, very different and almost never the environment. So just to give you a sense, we started our first project in a slum in Buenos Aires. There they had never had waste collection. So we said to them, if you will separate your waste, we will collect it. And the motivating factor for them was their children were no longer playing in streets full of waste. So it was a health issue and a parental, caring issue. We then moved into an industrial town called Oliveria outside of Buenos Aires. And there it was about modernization, because their vision is that modern cities have recycling programs. And so the entire communication was based on taking Oliveria into the next generation of modern city. In Indonesia, in Bali, which is a predominantly Hindu island, and there are many, most of Indonesia is actually Muslim, but in Bali it's predominantly Hindu. There is a part of the Hindu religion which says you should never make anyone's life worse. So we share with them what it looks like to sort mixed waste. And they understand that if they don't sort their waste, they are making somebody else's life worse, because the waste that they're sorting through is dirty. So to give you a sense of what that looks like, this side, on the right, your left, you've got mixed waste, right? So you have to open those bags up, go through lots of sanitary waste and food waste, etc., to pull out a few things that are then often highly contaminated. On the other side, this is what it looks like. It's still not clean, but it smells a lot different in that room to be going through waste that has been separated out for you. right? So this is, when we show pictures of what it looks like and what it feels like for people who are working in this space, we can get people to change their behaviors. And then we also, we rely very much on the waste pickers or community members to actually teach each other. So we train the trainer on this. And I want to show you a little video just to show you what this feels like when you have somebody who's really bought in. This video it will highlight a woman named Marialina, who was one of our first waste collectors that we worked with in the slum in Buenos Aires.
A mí me cambió que la gente me diga, ¿y cómo es esto? ¿Y cómo puedo reciclar? Yo veo que hay menos basura y más reciclado por ahora y antes no era así. Yo quiero que se expanda, que todo el sector y que todas las cooperativas podamos hacer eso. Creo que va a ser muy lindo y mucho mejor de aquí a un año. Yo lo veo que ya todo el mundo esté reciclando.
So you can see even, she's a real waste warrior. She's been an amazing person for us to work with. In order to then get this behavior change to stick, you have to also provide the service that will convince people that their work that they're doing in their households or their businesses is actually flowing through into the rest of the system. One of the biggest challenges we have is if people don't believe that the municipality or the village is keeping their waste separated, and then they just start mixing it again. And then convincing them to start the recycling behavior again is even harder the next time. So we do a lot of capability building and education with municipal or environmental ministry workers, whoever has control of the waste management system. These are Delterra, they are the Ministry of Environment in Indonesia, learning about why is waste management important? How much of your budget should be going to waste management? How do you make the different pieces integrate? Because many times the trucks are run by one division, the decisions on the material recovery facility are run by another one, who owns the landfill is another ministry. So you have to figure out how to bring them all together and have them understand how all of their behaviors are interlinked into making this a successful situation. So we spent a lot of time educating them. And then, of course, we have to educate the waste workers, too. We're particularly worried about health and safety, making sure that they have personal protection, PPE, and then also helping them to really understand the value of the service that they are delivering. Because many of these people are illiterate, or they come from very poor or abusive backgrounds, and they haven't ever been told what you're doing is a service to the planet as well as to the community. And one of the things that we found in this process is that we actually were able to justify the training of these people on this by the savings that we were seeing in the material recovery facilities. So because they took ownership of the equipment when they had a truck that was making noises, instead of just letting it break down, they actually went and reported it, and it got the maintenance it needed before it became a super expensive problem. So tracking all of those data is really important. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in Indonesia.
Mana pemilahan di rumah tangga, ya. Jadi mana sudah disisihkan, mana itu organik, residu, yang mau daur ulang, itu sudah saya sendiri. Jadi masalah kerjaan kita juga lebih intens, lebih intens. Kalau bagi saya sama semua tim di sini, tidak ada itu punya rasa malu, melainkan tambah bangga kita jadi seorang tukang sampah.
Apa yang kita butuhkan itu dah yang kita kasih solusi sama kita. Jadi kita kerja di sini tidak ada keluhan apa. Apa yang kita keluh, apa yang kita rasakan tidak enak, kita pasti ada solusinya.
Desa Cerdas project to be sort of like a laboratory for all of us to work together, to learn together.
Ya di sini karena sistemnya kekeluargaan, jadi sejauh ini sih baik-baik aja, senang gitu lah istilahnya, kayak di rumah sendiri lah kerjanya gitu.
Harapan saya untuk Desa Cerdas ke depannya bisa menjadi salah satu learning center untuk TPS 3R di Indonesia.
It's a hardship location to work in. Okay, and then the next thing is actually we've been experimenting with enforcement of this behavior. So we've now got the community leaders so excited about this that they're asking what's next, and we can say to them now, we'd actually like you to get involved. This program is a new program that we've just started. It's called No Sortation, No Collection. The Indonesia team is really good at coming up with cool names for their programs. And what you can see here is the guy in white here is actually the head of hygiene and environment in the regency that we're working in. And he's out at 4 o'clock in the morning helping make sure that people are sorting their waste, but also that the drivers are not collecting waste that hasn't been sorted. Because it's really hard to convince the drivers to irritate people in the community by not collecting that waste. So every 2 weeks, they'll go through and collect everything that's sitting in the street. But if you don't separate your waste and those drivers aren't collecting your waste, you are going to irritate your neighbors really badly. So this has been incredibly successful. We've had a 60% compliance overnight with very small behavior change effect. So now we're going to experiment with putting the components of behavior change together with the enforcement to see if we can get it up to 100%. We've also been working on building markets for hard-to-recycle materials. And in this case, it's LDPE that we've been focused on. So this is a sorting center where people are sorting waste out of, this one was a mixed waste, but they weren't taking all of the flexible plastics. So what we recognized was at the end of this conveyor belt, there was a skip full of flexible plastics that were relatively well sorted. And those are technically recyclable, although they are still hard to recycle because of the economics. So we then decided, could we figure out a program that could actually get that material recycled instead of sending it to landfill? So the first thing we did was look at what is the cost differential for the community, for the recycling and the sortation. And we created a subsidy that went to the cooperative themselves, but it was a short-term subsidy because we actually figured out that over the course of a year, they could get good enough at this, efficient enough at it, that we could bring the subsidy down. So now we tell them at the front, we're going to be bringing this subsidy down, but you get it for a short period of time to build trust and also while you build that learning curve on the cost to sort. We then trained the workers on how to sort and how to recognize the right waste. And then we traced and verified it all because, of course, we didn't want to be paying subsidies for tons that weren't recycled. So we built a two-way verification system to be able to trace that material. We then also worked with a very helpful recycler who was willing to work with us on this, and we found money from the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, and actually Dow helped out with some of this as well, to be able to buy them additional washers to be able to wash that material. And then we started working with them on expanding the sales of this. So a lot of this material is going to go into the making new plastic bags, trash bags, etc. But actually, one of the products that Andre showed this morning is also, this is Revolut. It also is going into some of the Revolut product as well. It has to be blended. It can't just be the pure municipal, post-municipal waste. But what's really interesting about this is we were able to show that we were able to make this economic if we reached a certain scale. So it reached, when it reached about between 600 and 800 tons a month, we could then compete with virgin plastic in the market. So that makes it a much more stable market over time for this to work. And so we actually think this is one of the few post-municipal waste recycling systems that you will find in the Global South for flexible films. And to date, the program has recycled 6,500 tons or plus. It's going every month. To give you a sense, as we talked about different hot tubs and trucks and stuff, I looked it up, it's 23 blue whales. And over the course of all of our programs so far, in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, we've been able to recycle 25,000 tons of material that would have been going to landfill. So this is in addition to what informal waste pickers were already collecting and recycling. It does include organics, which adds to the tons a lot. So just to give you a story of stickiness, like what does this look like when it really works? Oliveria, that city, that industrial town that I mentioned to you, this is a city that we worked in with to understand what is the blueprint of what we should be doing. We did everything with them. We built their material recovery facility. We actually bought them recycling trucks. This was all a lot of help from Amcor and the Alliance to End Plastic Waste financially. And we did the behavior change program. We rolled out that behavior change program ourselves so that we could learn exactly what we should be training the trainers on. We did everything. After 3 years, the mayor changed. This is a major problem in municipal systems. Right? So the mayor looked at Delterra and said, "You're part of the previous administration's program. We don't want you here," and literally kicked us out and would not let us talk to the municipal workers at all. However, 2 years on, just a couple months ago, I posted on this. Even though Delterra is gone, the community has continued the behavior change strategies that we labeled. Our brand is not anywhere on it, but that's not what we care about, really. They are now have returned to publicly reporting on how much material they are recycling as a city. They relaunched the strategy we developed for multi-households. So this is a major issue. How do you deal with apartment blocks, right? How do you get people in apartment blocks recycling? And they signed a formal contract with the waste workers who we had brought in off the dump and trained to run the material recovery facility. And then now are paying them to roll out the program to the remaining 20% of the city that we didn't get to. So for me, this is huge success, right? That we've gone through an administration change, they still feel ownership for the program, and they're still running it and still recycling. And this is a city that they were collecting a few cans and bottles, so maybe less than 1% recycling rates. Now we're looking at 30 to 35% of recyclables collected today. So that's pretty exciting to me. And in an economy, as you probably have seen in the news, that is collapsing around their ears. So they're still running systems like this in Argentina. So then the next question is, how do you start to scale that? So our unit of scale is the city. How do you scale it? So I'm just going to give you one slide to show our exploration of this. We haven't yet really cracked this nut, but we're thinking about this in terms of, we started out, as I said, in that slum, in that neighborhood, which is about 40,000 people. It's a little bit bigger than the city of Princeton, by the way. And we actually figured out that that wasn't the right unit of scale because the decisions about waste management were not being made at that level. Buenos Aires is an incredibly corrupt waste management system, so we didn't want to get involved there because, as many of you will know, there's a lot of mafia in waste management, so we decided to avoid the metro area of Buenos Aires, although we have come back and started to work there now, and go out to one city of 120,000 people to try and figure out how to do this. So that was all Evidn. We then, because we were successful there, but we worked that program for 3 years with 11 people on the ground, fully dedicated to running in that city. So that was a huge investment of resources for us. Plus, we built all the infrastructure, et cetera, for them. So now the question is, how do we go from one city to multiple cities? And the team is in the process of working through how do we work with the cities that are anxious to work with us, who have existing infrastructure that is underused. And I'm proud to say that we, over the course of the last few years, we have worked with cities across Argentina that the residential population is over 8 million people. So that's about 20% of the population of Argentina. We're now moving into Brazil in doing a similar thing, and the story is very similar in Indonesia. So a couple of things just to leave you with in terms of the learnings that we've had from these programs. The first one is to love your problem, not the solution. It's really important to experiment, to collect data, to be ready to say this didn't work and move on and try the next thing, right? So making sure that you don't become so wedded to what you think is the solution that you won't let go of it. The next one is make sure you partner first. There are always organizations on the ground who have tried lots of things and who are really good and really know that space and will help you build trust, especially although we hire local people. My entire team in Indonesia are all Indonesians. We are still seen as a global international organization. So you want to partner with others who can also help build that trust with you. And design for inclusion, especially in this space, waste pickers. You do not want to be displacing waste pickers in the system. You want to make sure that you're trying to include them, bring them into formal systems where they have better incomes, et cetera. And then, like I said, focus really on experimenting and learning what works, and then collect lots and lots and lots of data to figure out which parts of it are working so that you can distill it down to the essence of the pieces that work, and then scale up to the rest of the country if you're lucky, or maybe in Bali, maybe just the island for a while. That's a good, big enough goal for now. So thank you for listening. I really appreciate it, and we'll be happy to take some questions in the panel. Thank you. You want this?
Well, thank you so much, Shannon, for that very engaging and practical and, dare I say, inspiring presentation about how we actually can affect behavioural change. And as Chris mentioned earlier, my name is John Pickering and I'll be the moderator for this final session this afternoon. But I'm also joined on the stage by Sarah Boll. And Sarah is the Executive Director of the Office of Sustainability here at Princeton University. And Sarah, I'd actually like to bring you into the conversation straight away and just ask you if you'd be willing to just tell the group a little bit about, of course, the Office of Sustainability and yourself, but your approach to circularity. And if there's one or two examples, for example, of projects that are happening here on campus that we might be able to learn about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. First, thank you to the Ann Center for inviting me today. There was a lot of inspiring information that I learned today around the topic of circularity, which it can be very overwhelming, to be quite honest. As somebody leading a team who's trying to lead a community to be more thoughtful about circularity, it can feel overwhelming, so it was great to get some inspiration today. For those of you who are not familiar, the university currently has a sustainability action plan with 7 focus areas. One of those focus areas is waste reduction, specifically trying to reduce waste to landfill. We also mentioned reducing food waste to landfill specifically, and then there's like a little couple sentences about sustainable purchasing. So how are we doing with that? Our reduction of waste to landfill has been pretty stagnant, pretty much since the inception of our sustainability action plan. We're doing much better around food waste reduction to landfill because we have a very active composting program. Again, for those of you who are not familiar, well, you didn't hear any of that, but we have a food waste, closer?
I think it might not be on.
Oh, it was on. It went out. How's this? Is this better? Whoa.
Yeah.
So maybe just to recap, Sustainability Action Plan, focus area, one of the 7 focus areas is on waste reduction, specifically reducing waste to landfill, reducing food waste in that waste stream, and then we do make a nod to sustainable purchasing. We haven't really moved the needle on how much we're diverting from the waste stream to landfill overall, except in the area of food waste recycling. We have a very active composting program in our residential dining halls. All of the pre-consumer waste from the kitchen side and the servery side of those units is sent to Trenton Renewables. We also have a on-campus small-scale aerobic digester, which was a pilot program called the Scrap Lab. Scrap stands for Sustainable Composting Research at Princeton. It has its own website and blog, so go check that out. And that program was really trying to do what Princeton really does best, which is to find a solution to a problem throughout the industry. And that specific problem was, we all know how to compost food scraps, but the industry of compostable items like food, plates, cups, cutlery, it's not regulated. So those products are, they're made from all different types of things. They compost in different environments at different rates. And so the Scrap Lab was stood up as a pilot program to specifically do research about how those things compost in an aerobic small-scale digester situation. So that's a program, John, that has been successful and is continuing to operate at a somewhat reduced capability right now. Some of the other areas, I think, where we see as the Office of Sustainability, at least interest from the students, is in the fight against fast fashion. We have a student program called MEND that is actually, I feel like it's growing in popularity, and it's a group of students who work actually for our office who do pop-ups to help people learn how to sew or fix a button or whatever. And that same group, with some help from some of our other eco reps, also does a handful of clothing swap events throughout campus throughout the year. Thank you.
Of course. Sarah, you mentioned at the start there, it could be or it can be overwhelming. Would you be willing to share with us what are one or two things that come to mind about the challenges? Like, what makes this difficult in terms of circularity here at Princeton? Like, what are you dealing with that makes it challenging?
Yeah, great question. And certainly nothing as challenging as what Shannon just presented on. But the challenge at Princeton is, although we're a relatively small university, we are disparate, right? We have a gazillion centers and departments and sub-offices of those things. And so communicating effectively around what can be done around circularity is more challenging at this university than you might initially think. It's also part of that, or big part of that communication from my viewpoint is really fighting against the economy or the instant consumer gratification sort of environment that we live in. Oh, the culture of convenience. That's the phrase I was looking for. I mean, we see some progress in that, right? Like Shannon and I, rightly so, have our reusable water bottles. You didn't see these so much 10 years ago, but now basically every student on campus carries one of these. But we're all overscheduled, overbusy in this particular community, and so those convenience items are still very much at play on our campus. And trying to communicate that if you just maybe take a little extra time and figure out a solution that is truly reusable, it would make a big impact if we all did it collectively. But the communication part to a community like this is one of the bigger challenges.
Thank you. Shannon, I'd like to bring you back in here on the culture of convenience term, because that's a big consideration when it comes to understanding consumer behavior. And of course, the overview you gave of behavior change and some of the behavior science behind the programs you do, which was wonderful, I think speaks to some of that. But the question that I have is, are there things that you've seen through your work, especially in the Global South, about the culture of convenience? And is it a different phenomenon there? Is it a different driver of behavior? Does it not exist? Is it more prominent? Where is that, and how does that figure into your program design?
So I think we all think that the sort of takeout stuff that we deal with here and in Europe is, or maybe not in Europe, as Andre shared, is pretty prevalent, is not prevalent in the Global South, but I actually think it's worse in the Global South. And I think part of the reason for that is because labor is so cheap, right? So I can order a meal and have it delivered on a motorbike in Indonesia, and that meal is like $3, whereas in the US it would be $25 to $40 by the time I got it to my door, right, with DoorDash or somebody to deliver it, right? So that means that a lot of people in Indonesia and in Latin America are not often cooking for themselves. They're actually ordering out much more. And that means there's a lot of transportation and a lot of waste that comes. I actually had the experience, we live out in the country, and my kids had no access to that type of thing. I took them to Indonesia 2 years ago to sort of experience, and I put them in one of these facilities and had them sort waste, which they loved me for. But I left them at the Airbnb one day, and they found Gojek, which is the delivery system and biking system. It's the Uber of Indonesia. And I came home, and they had ordered so much food that the trash can was literally a pile like this of disposable food stuff. And I said to them, how do you do this? You just sorted this waste. You know that this economy can't deal with this, you know? But they were like, but Mom, I could order boba tea from that store for $1.20. And that store, I got a hamburger from that store for $3. And in total, I only spent $10, you know? It was like, so I think it's very difficult. There are, Gojek in particular, we've talked to them about, you know, can we help them figure out how to get reusable containers? And there are lots of Asian cultural aspects of this, right? In India and in China, there are metal containers that often get returned. So there are some beautiful stories of how, you know, you could change this, but it's difficult once it's proliferated to really change it. And I think the other challenge is that a lot of people just don't understand that the way that their waste is being treated is dangerous to them as well. So one of the nonprofits that works there that offers collection services and recycling services, I turned around to the guy who was the COO of it and said, well, what happens in your neighborhood? Who collects your waste? And he goes, oh, we have an empty lot and everybody just dumps their waste there and we burn it once a month. And I said to him, where do you live in connection to this? And he said, it's right next door to me. I just close all my windows on that day. And I was like, that this is toxic, right? And he was like, oh, I guess I hadn't really thought about it. I just grew up with that. That's the way it was always done. So a lot of it is informing people, but they don't really understand. So that's why you have to find the message that does resonate with people, that's culturally appropriate.
And presumably the messenger as well. What I noticed about that first video that you showed with the lady that spoke about bringing about, I guess you'd call it behavioral change, is that she was kind of a social influencer of sorts locally. What I'm really interested in, how do you identify the right person to do that and be the person that conveys that message?
So the two people that you saw in those videos, Paxis is the man that was speaking, and then Marialina, they are exceptional, right? And that's why they're in our videos, because they were comfortable speaking on film and really are passionate about this. But actually, I think it often just matters. It's about training them on the message more than it is about finding the right person. So for example, we started out training. There are groups of women in Indonesia that are the wives of all of the political leaders. I'd like to say that some of the political leaders are women, but they aren't at the village level. They are in the national level, but not in the village level. So all the wives come together in a group called PKK. So we trained the wives to go out and do the education. That works pretty well, right? Until the village found out that they actually weren't sorting their waste at home. So I think what matters is more the consistency of the message, and that that you get the people that are going to be delivering the message hosting that first. And we've actually trained a whole bunch of women since that, because it is usually the women in the households in all of the cultures that we're working in that are doing this work themselves. But then we also have just started a program in Indonesia called He for She, because what we find is that while the women do the work, the men often will tell them not to. So we now have to go back and educate all the men about why this is important and why they should allow their wives and daughters and maids to do this work in the household.
I have a further question for both of you, and then in a moment we might turn it open to the group as well. One thing that strikes me is in common between the two bodies of work that you lead is to do with this idea of affecting systems level change. And in many ways, it's a human system that we're talking about. And what I'm really interested in about that, and Sarah, I might start with yourself here at Princeton, or if you want to refer to other work that you've done in the past as well, but how you understand what that system is and kind of map it. And then within that, think about, well, what can we actually target? How do we prioritize? How do we understand what the major barriers are, for example, and work out what the action points can be? Because it can be overwhelming, is what I'm getting at. Some people find this, what do you mean, this human system? What is a system? And so on and so forth. How do we get some clarity about that? And I might start with you, Sarah.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this question, John, because you're giving me an opportunity to talk about work that my team and I are doing right now. And the answer to this question is, we don't necessarily have the answer, and we need to get out into our community and ask this community these questions that you just posed to me. And we're doing that right now because we're in the process of updating the university's sustainability action plan, hoping to release a new plan in the summer of 2026. And so to do that, we have an advisory committee. The advisory committee identified 9 different working groups that we have stood up. One of those working groups is about circularity. And across all that sort of advisory structure, we are actively engaging with about 100 members of this community between staff, faculty, and students. And those 100 people in between our working group sessions are going out and engaging with, I don't know how many more, but this is the way that we, as a relatively small team in this community, are trying to bring in the voice of the community to identify what is the landscape, what are the barriers, why doesn't everybody carry around a water bottle and reusable cutlery, But then also what we can do as an organization, like what seems achievable around sustainable purchasing, just getting the community to tell us both the problem and the solution is how we come up with a plan that we can actually act on and execute.
So it is in many ways quite literally about talking to people, about understanding their perspective, and I guess you could say building some trust in the process that you're undertaking. Shannon, I'm interested in your take on this as well, and I'd acknowledge the slides that you had that sort of documented the framework that you've got to almost like a systems map of the different stakeholder groups or actors and so forth. Within that, that's still quite a lot. And how do you drill in from there? Like, how do you know? Because there's always got to be constraints. There'll be budgets. There'll be project timelines. There'll be other things that you're considering as you're doing that mapping. How do you go about it?
So the way we started creating that map, we were very privileged when we started Delterra because we were actually McKinsey.org, so we were sponsored by McKinsey, and we did what we called our World Waste Tour, partly because we thought we were going to go out and find an organization that was doing amazing things and help them scale, which we did find. We found lots of amazing organizations, but none of them were trying to solve the whole system. And so basically we just borrowed from each of the ones that were doing amazing things and tried to put it all together in one place. But that World Waste Tour was incredibly informative. That was like, I told my team, no day one hypothesis. Just go at this in terms of collection of data. Let's try and understand where all the challenges are. And we asked dozens of questions and collected all sorts of information, like how much is LDPE per kilo being sold for, and how much is aluminium being sold for, and where is the PET going in the system, and and why do you need an aggregator? Those sorts of things. So that was very much part of the whole sort of understanding why the system exists today. And then we started asking them questions like, what would you do if you had an extra $100? What would you buy? How would you be able to improve your facilities? So a lot of times it was things like aggregators need more space. If they had a big warehouse, they could make a lot more money. Or if we had a shredder, we could do more organic composting. So understanding where the gaps were in the system. And then in the projects that we've done, we've sort of sequentially started trying to, we tried to develop an idea of what the solution was for each of those pieces. And we've always asked ourselves, we always are trying to look at the whole system because you want to make sure that what you're doing is not individually correct and collectively wrong, right? It's very easy to find solutions that are individually correct and collectively wrong. So a perfect example is things like programs that will go out and just collect the high-value recyclables, right? You then are taking all of the value out of the municipal waste system and making it harder to cross-subsidize the collection and sorting of the low-value materials. So those kinds of, we wanted to avoid those kinds of mistakes in the design of what we were doing. So we're always trying to take that sort of, all right, take a step back and say, is this solution that I found for this problem that I'm trying to solve, is it going to make the next step or the previous step harder to manage? And I would just say it's very much like sort of acupuncture across the system. We're just sequentially solving problems. Now, we started on the supply side, and there have been other organizations that have tried to start on the demand side, right? Minderoo Foundation, for example, spent a lot of time on the demand side. And the reason that we started on the supply side really for us is because we're working in the global south. So just putting demand into the market is not actually going to solve a collection and sortation problem, because if you don't have the infrastructure and you don't have the know-how, you're still not going to get the materials into the system. So we found that in the markets that we were working in, there was latent demand that was not being met. And so we started on the supply side. And we have just we started in behavior change with households, then we went to businesses, we started on collection systems, and we just kind of started working across the space to try and figure out how to make it all work.
Incredible. Thank you, Shannon. All right, I'm going to turn over to the audience now. I could see a question here. I think we've got some microphones coming around. The gentleman here with his hand up, I'll go to first. We'll just wait for the mic just in the center. Thank you.
Compelling presentation. Thank you so much. The question that I've got as we think about behavioral change and building acceptance within the community, political structure of the economy comes down to, how do you get organic community support to build that sense that we, members of the community, are doing something really special. And that's going to change the life and, and show the ways in which it's happening, not only for ourselves, but our children and our neighbors.
So you're asking, how do you create that sense of what I do matters, right?
Yes.
So I think the first part is coming down to that, that point I made about trying to find what incentivizes this change, and what will make me change my behavior in my household where nobody's watching, right? And we do find that in different cultures it's very different. Sometimes it's social pressure. So Indonesia is a very hierarchical system. If we send a letter from the village leader and a religious leader, the desa adat, overnight we get people at least trying to recycle. 60% of people will start trying to recycle. They may not always know because they haven't received all the education, etc. You have to think about your sequencing of what you're rolling out. So you have to find that thing that motivates, right? There's also that Hindu culture piece. But where we find community, which often exists in many of these places, we then also appeal to that community. So neighborhoods have meetings called Banjar meetings in Indonesia. Even if you move away from your neighborhood, you often still pay into your Banjar fees because of where you grew up. And that's where we'll do the education with communities as well. I think the other thing that we ran into in the slum that we worked in Buenos Aires is this is an immigrant population, right? So there are people from all over Latin America in the slum. And so they didn't have a sense of community. So actually, the program itself created a sense of community. So they suddenly, there was a service that no one had given them before, waste collection. They had to walk their waste out to the edges of the slum and put them in dumpsters that Veolia had out there for them. But nobody was collecting waste inside because it was too dangerous. So the waste collectors that you see there are residents of the slum, and that sort of created that sense of community because they were making their community a better place. But we did run into one of the challenges, which was people said to us, "What happens to this material? I mean, I'm happy to sort it for you, but where does it go?" They didn't really understand what recycling meant, and so we actually created a little museum for them. Here's a recycled tennis shoe, or here's a recycled bottle, or so that they could actually see that the things that they were collecting were actually going back into new products. But it's not. I think maybe the challenge that you're talking about is much more of a global north challenge because we have such a global view and we're fed so much information, then we have the sense that our actions are very small, and what's the point? But the reality is that they all add up. And if we don't solve, consumer stuff is going to be a small part of the solution, but it's still a part of it, right? So we have to do it all. We can't just ignore the stuff that we're doing as well.
Sarah.
Yeah, I would also like to speak to this, thinking of the community of Princeton University, right, which is a much more privileged community than what Shannon has been working and been talking about. But the same problem still exists, right? Is how do you get people in a privileged community to care about recycling and organic diversion, and also just about better consumer habits, right? Like starting with reduction rather than even reuse or recycling. And what's interesting as I was listening to Shannon, it's just kind of the same answer. Like you have to find those motivators, and they're not going to be the same for every person that you run into. And in fact, as the little bit of communication we're doing with campus right now, specifically around the transition to centralized waste collection, is trying to get at all these different things, like whatever the hook is to the audience, right? For some people, it might be enough that we're doing this transition because it makes our recycling stream cleaner, and therefore our recycling will be more recycled rather than diverted to landfill. We talk about environmental justice, that our waste goes to a landfill in eastern Pennsylvania that directly impacts the community of Trenton. But trying to find those motivators, it can be difficult. Again, I think the work that we're undergoing right now to sort of engage the community in identifying those will hopefully help us create a plan that's successful and actionable. But the motivator of the individuals you're talking to is definitely the beginning of the solution.
Yeah, and we have to be ready to step outside of the environmental argument, because that might matter to those of us who are mission-driven about that topic, but it might not. It doesn't matter to the majority of people, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to our next question. I think we have. Does someone have the mic already? Or there's at the front here. Thank you, Andrea. And just a reminder to state your name and affiliation.
So great panel and presentation, Andrea with Dell. I was thinking about if recycling rate was correlated to education level, Sarah would have the easier job in the world, right? This is Princeton after all. But then that thought goes into in industry, we need to put a dollar. I try to put like a measurement system in everything that I discussed earlier. How do we think about what is the cost of this behavior change? Like, you are going to Brazil. If you want to suddenly have overnight 25 million people re-educated, how much does it cost? And I don't know, John, too, because you have the expertise in the field. Like from other fields, there's got to be something we can learn from other spaces where we have to completely re-educate. But how much does it cost?
So I will just say that us working in the Global South helps, because labor is very cheap. Although we have found ways to make it cheaper to do that door-to-door education. For example, there are dengue educators in Brazil that we've now trained to also do recycling education. So when they're going door-to-door about dengue anyway, they're also educating about recycling. But I don't have an exact dollar amount for you, but I will say that we have looked at the cost of per unit of material then that ends up recycled for each portion of our program, building the MRF, training the waste workers, training the households and businesses. And what we find is you have a higher return on investment on education and on source separation than you do on any other part of the recycling value chain. And that's one of the things that kind of gets lost in all of this, because municipalities usually just see it as a basic cost. They don't really understand. But it is, because it generates so much more clean material going into the system, it is the best investment you can make, because it's not infrastructure. Infrastructure is expensive, right? So training people and having people out there door-to-door educating and making a bunch of flyers and magnets is relatively cheap. So we have a paper on our website that you can find that it's called Making Sense of Behavior Change. And it does this, and it shows you this analysis of even the bins. Like, bins are very expensive, recycling bins. So all of those pieces of infrastructure, they don't generate the kind of increase in material flow that you see from behavior change.
And I could add to that by framing it, Andre, in a way of what is the cost to not do the behavior change? And I can think of examples in agriculture, for example, in Australia with the Great Barrier Reef, where there's significant threats to the reef because of agricultural runoff. And the desire there is to see farmers change their behavior. And over several decades, there have been literally hundreds of millions of dollars of investments, in fact, over $1 billion in the form of different incentive schemes, the development of policies, agronomic advice, all sorts of things, grants and so on. And the rate of change was nowhere near enough to protect what we needed to protect in terms of water quality. And it was once the behavioural science component was brought in to better understand some of these underlying, let's call it drivers of behaviour, that we started to see the acceleration of adoption. I don't have the exact figure for what rolling that out to the entire Great Barrier Reef marine park would do, but it wouldn't certainly be hundreds of millions of dollars. So in that sense, I think there is value for money there, but it's an important question, but we don't know because that scale of investment hasn't yet been made. All right, we'll go to the question. I'll keep alternating sides to the lady there with the hand up. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you. Very nice talk. Really impressive. I'm Pan from Princeton, MAE. I actually have two questions. First one, I live on campus, staff housing. My question is, why there is only 2 bins when I take out my daily trash? So even though I want to do this trash sorting, and my husband has no problem with that, it feels like the system is preventing me to do that. That's my first question. The second one is, We talked about a lot about how much resources we should put on and how much energy and money we should put on this wasting, sorting. Can you comment on, like, for a company, what's the general guidelines? Like, how much revenue of a company you think it should spend on this kind of wasting management? And also for a country, what % of GDP we should spend on those like environmental waste management? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, there's a bit there, but maybe Sarah, if you start with the bins.
So maybe we need to bring Andre back up here too.
The first question, why is the recycling system different at staff housing than it is on campus, is because the university does not collect waste from staff house. It's part of the municipal system run by the city of Princeton. And I honestly cannot tell you why they have persisted with single stream recycling. But the simple answer is the campus is operating this building and the campus buildings, and the city is picking up waste for staff housing.
Maybe you need to start offering. No, or at least bring your recyclables to campus.
I will just say, I mean, it does make me want to go at. There is a town of Princeton sustainability organization called Sustainable Princeton that I interact with on a regular basis. But this is going to make me ask them, you know, how successful is the single stream recycling, because we had to move away from it. So you have given me a follow-up task.
So the answer to that in the literature is that you get a higher proportion of people participating if you have single stream recycling, but you get more contamination in your waste stream. So you end up with roughly the same, but that increase in people participating is helpful. So I don't know for a company, and I don't know at the GDP level, but I do know that at a municipal level, the average municipality is spending about 30% of their budget on waste management, which is about right. If you think about the services that municipalities are offering in general, it's sort of street cleaning, cutting trees, mowing grass, the roads, some of the roads sometimes, parking spaces, etc. So 30% seems pretty fair, that given that it's the biggest piece of the puzzle. The other side of that equation to think about is, though, we are asking big companies now to have the start of their supply chain in a municipality, which is a very fickle beginning of your supply chain, right? So municipalities are worrying about all these other things. They are not experts in waste collection or in recycling, and that means that when budgets get cut, material recovery facilities get closed, and during COVID, a lot of places just stopped recycling altogether because they weren't sure how safe it was, and then getting the population to start recycling and separating their waste again is a big push, and so they never started again. So it's a difficult situation to be in, that you're asking a municipality to actually be the source of a supply chain for multinational companies. So I do think that waste management as a whole at about 30% is about right. But I think that the municipalities need a lot of help because they're not all going to know how to do it.
So can you give me an idea, like how much of the university's budget goes to waste management and composting and recycling? Because way back when I was like on a committee in Manhattan, and it was a huge percentage of the city budget, like 5%. And so like every little bit you save, that means money can be spent on something else.
I do not have a specific answer of percentage of overall budget. I can, if you want to connect afterwards, I can find out. But the idea of the less waste you create in the first place, the more money you save, absolutely is true for us, like any other community. And one example I can give you of a reuse program that my office runs is we have a move-out collection program for when the students move out at the end of the year, and we actually store, sort, and clean all that stuff, and we sell it back to the incoming students. That program actually saves money overall because it is less stuff that building services has to pick up a lot of that. During that time, it's a very rapid turnover for our buildings to get ready for the summer programming. So it actually saves money on overtime for building services, not having to remove those items from buildings. So absolutely true.
Thank you, Sarah. We've got time for one more, and this patient gentleman here. I'll just grab a microphone for you. We'll grab the mic.
My name is Glenn Hyman. I'm actually here representing a company called Polykinetics. And for those who have never heard of Polykinetics, they have an amazing closed-loop system to recycle all kinds, just about all types, not just 1, 2, and 5 type plastics, but just about, most plastics, okay? And they have a byline, refuge to revenue. I'm hearing a lot of cost. I'm not hearing costs turned into revenue. Well, guess what? Polykinetics can do that. I have a question specific for Sarah. I think you're probably talking about the Fallsington Waste Management landfill when you mentioned that there's an impact on Trenton. So I'd be curious as to what kind of cost there is to Princeton University, and I don't suspect you know the answer, but if you do, that's great. And I'll call them dumping fees that you might be paying to the waste management landfill in Fallsington, Falls Township, Pennsylvania. I happen to live, I grew up in Levittown. I'm very familiar with that dump. My son played on a soccer field, and one day I was lining that field, and it was raining. I got covered with orange soot. Where did that come from? Most likely the landfill. I was not a very happy camper in staining a raincoat that I had on that day and my clothes. So yes, there's a lot of pollution over at that landfill. And then I would just like to know in general, I mean, over in Indonesia, are you turning, the waste plastics into some kind of reusable material, polymers or whatever, and generating revenue to where the revenue is exceeding the cost, hopefully. So I know that's 2 questions, but I hope
Thank you.
that you can
We might
appreciate that.
try and do a briefer answer to each, because I know we're about to wrap up. So maybe we start with the Indonesian example and then over to,
So we help the communities to sell the waste. We don't own it, right? We just enable. But what we found was in making one of those sorting centers in Indonesia cost effective, that the sale of the recyclables only covered about 20% of the cost of delivering the collection service and the sortation. And that's partly because you have to ship all the material from Bali to Java in order to sell it. So the transportation costs are also high. And then we also are trying to build offtake markets for things that don't have offtake. But that's really based on the sale of PET, aluminium, sometimes glass, and cardboard.
Thank you, Shannon. Sarah.
Yeah, thanks for knowing ahead of time. I don't know the answer to that question, but similar to the question earlier, it now has made me curious and to understand what our tipping fees are at that landfill versus how much we pay Trenton Renewables versus whatever kind of arrangement we have with our MRF for the recycled goods. So I will follow up on that.
Let's wrap it up there, folks. And another round of applause for Shannon and Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's been a day. So the circular economy kind of sounds simple when you frame it as reduce, reuse, recycle. Just like decarbonising the economy sounds easy when you say net zero by 2050. But in fact, these systems are extraordinarily complex. So today we've kind of started from one of the world's biggest producers of ethylene and looked at the challenges they have of decarbonising that production and also introducing more recycled feedstocks. And, it turns out that you need demand, right? You need customers who are willing to pay the additional cost. It turns out you need policy and regulation. And it turns out you're going to need behaviour change. We then went into the science and the innovators, the people who are spending millions trying to prove small-scale demonstrations. And then we went into the panel where people are spending hundreds of millions trying to build industrial-scale demonstrations. And all of them have challenges, but all of them, the thing that struck me was the extraordinary passion and belief in the challenge they are trying to solve. And then the last session, of course, is always the one that's really exciting, is how do you make this happen on the ground? And I love the contrast with developing countries versus rich, privileged, as Sarah put it, which is exactly how we should think of ourselves. But I want to finish with Shannon's quote, which I loved. Love your problem, not your solution. Partner first and design for inclusion, and focus on experimenting to learn what works, then scale rapidly. I think decarbonisation, circular economy, most of the global challenges can learn from this. So thank you to all of our moderators. Thank you to our panellists. Thank you, Andre, for a great keynote to kick us off. And then I have a bunch of other thank yous. And I want you to all stand up. So Vivian, Diana, Ashley, Diane, Sarah, Charlie, who are Laurie, if you're still here. These are the people who actually make it happen, right? There's a lot of organisation, a lot of logistics to make a day like this happen. And lastly, Michelle, you can stand up too. So Michelle, as co-chair, is responsible for helping plan, organise, identify, recruit speakers, and pulling it all together. So thank you, and last of all, but thank you all for coming. Thanks for hanging in there, and I hope you got as much out of today as I did. And outside now we will have, see, I cut this short. I saved 5 minutes at the end because this time is between me and a drink. So we're outside, we have the poster awards, and we can have some cocktails. Thank you, everyone, again.